Well, 14 high major college basketball programs have new coaches, and we take a stab at grading each new hire, starting with Mark Pope and John Calipari in the SEC.
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, folks? Welcome into the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, a daily national college hoop show, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am your host, Andy Patton, joined today by our weekly contributor and current host of the Locked On Jazz podcast, temporarily, Leaf Tulane. Thanks for coming on, Leaf. Folks, you are joining us at the place to get your college basketball content every single day. As a reminder, you can listen to the show ad-free on Amazon Music if you are not doing so already. Today's episode of Locked On College Basketball is brought to you by Monopoly Go. Folks, I'll admit it, I have a competitive side. I know Leaf has a competitive side as well, and we are big fans of Monopoly Go, the mobile hit twist on classic Monopoly. So join your friends and download Monopoly Go now free on the App Store or Google Play Store. All right, folks, pretty basic show today. 14 new high major programs. That includes programs like SMU, which are now high major programs, have made coaching changes this offseason. We're going to talk about those coaching changes and just give them a grade. Obviously, it is mid-April, or I guess late April now as we record this. And so judging head coaches based on just the first month or week or 2 weeks or whatever of their time as the head coach is a little premature, but we're just going to kind of give our knee-jerk reactions to these coaching changes and kind of what we've seen from them so far. And we're going to start here in the first segment with the SEC. There's 3 new head coaches in the SEC with nothing but respect for Mark Byington and Vanderbilt. The other 2 are a little bit more headliners than you would typically get in a coaching carousel year after year. Arkansas, of course, has to replace coach Eric Musselman, who goes to USC. We'll talk about that later in the show. And they choose to replace him by hiring John Calipari. After a 15-year tenure as the head coach of the Wildcats, Calipari departs, stays in the SEC, goes up to Fayetteville to coach the Razorbacks. Meanwhile, Kentucky, ultimately, after a pursuit of Scott Drew, a pursuit of Danny Hurley, an expected pursuit of Billy Donovan that didn't seem to really materialize into much more than just a casual conversation. Eventually, Kentucky ends up hiring BYU's Mark Pope, an alum of Kentucky, the team captain for that 1996 championship squad. So those are the 2 big ones. Of course, like we said, Byington takes over for Jerry Stackhouse at Vanderbilt. Leaf, I'm going to let you kind of pick which of those 3 or more likely 2 programs you want to talk about first with their new coaching change.
Well, I think the one I want to start with is Kentucky, just because that took the forefront of if they got Danny Hurley, then the power of basketball shifts. If they went back and took Billy Donovan, who prior to Danny Hurley was the last coach to win to back-to-backs, then everyone would have said, well, this is a slam dunk. He just needs a year to acclimate back to college basketball. And then they didn't get either. Then, of course, Scott Drew's cited in a restaurant in Waco, and everyone's like, oh, my gosh, he's not coming. And to me, I think that the disappointment was palpable in Kentucky fans. And then they have regained faith because Mark Pope had an awesome presser. Like, he had it in front of Rupp Arena, came out with a bus from the championship with all of his teammates from 1996, and talked about how banners is what they stand for. We're going to win in the SEC tournament in Nashville. We're going to win championships, and that's all that matters here at Kentucky. And so, but the fact of the matter is, Kentucky's got a barren closet, a guy who hasn't won a game in the NCAA tournament. Granted, he's played he's coached on a team that hasn't had too many chances. They're 0 for 2 in those tournaments, and they're probably their best team got cut off with COVID. So it's not a huge sample size, but I think you got to start the discussion there, because I think Mark Pope's a good offensive coach. I think he's got the energy. I think he can recruit, but you just got to win a little more if you're going to get the Kentucky job. And so that's why I think, in my mind, it's a little bit of okay, we'll wait and see. But if I'm judging for hiring for Kentucky, I don't like there's a semblance of a chance here. I need a slam dunk.
Yeah, and certainly they attempted to go for the slam dunks first, as they should have, as you always should if you're trying to hire at Kentucky basketball. It is the premier job in the sport. But I'm with you. I don't dislike the Mark Pope hire. I see the point of hey, it's certainly more of a gamble than you typically would want to take, grabbing a coach who hasn't won in the tournament. But The thing for Pope with me is like recruiting at BYU is so different than recruiting at Kentucky, and his energy, his enthusiasm, his love of Kentucky basketball and Big Blue Nation, I think is going to shine through in his recruiting efforts. So I'm actually not overly concerned about his ability to recruit. I think it's going to be different than it was in the John Calipari era. And I think most Kentucky fans have kind of accepted that, hey, when Calipari goes, we're not going to be able to recruit at the same level necessarily. But if that translates to more wins in the tournament, we're going to be happy about it. And that, of course, remains to be seen with Coach Pope. But I'm kind of a cautious optimist about this hire so far. And frankly, I would rather be Kentucky taking on Mark Pope than Arkansas taking on John Calipari. And I don't know if that's controversial. I don't know if people are going to disagree with that. Certainly John Calipari has had a better track record as a head coach of Mark Pope. He's Hall of Famer, all that stuff. I'm not arguing with any of that, but Calipari's shtick hasn't worked in like 5 years. And as soon as he goes to Arkansas, we find out he's basically taking his entire staff with him. He brings Kenny Payne back with him. And it just feels like there's not a lot of optimism in my mind, at least, that Calipari is going to go to Arkansas and make a lot of changes to the style that he coaches, the style of player that he recruits. And so I think you're probably going to see a lot of the same at Arkansas of talented players, talented young players, one and dones, watching fun basketball, talented players, but maybe not going to translate to a lot of success. And if you're Arkansas, you're coming off a really bad year last year. Eric Musselman's final season did not go well, but prior to that, you were having sustained success, making the tournament and at least winning a couple of games. And I don't know if Calipari is going to do a lot better than what Musselman was doing. And I guess that would be my concern if I was a fan in Fayetteville.
I'm right there with you. I've long been a critical thought guy on Calipari because college basketball to me is winning. If you are at a premier program, the Kentuckys, the Dukes, the North Carolina, the UCLAs, you have to win. You have to win. It doesn't matter if you've got 35 players that you can say, I coached them for 9 months. Like, who cares? Who cares that Calipari coached some of these guys for 9 months and now they're stars in the NBA? They have the most Olympians. They have the most NBA All-Stars.
They had the 30% of the All-Stars, which is just a mind-blowing stat when you consider.
But how many won? Just one. Anthony Davis won. And that was and I made this point on an NBA draft show recently that there's a generational prospect is an overused term. I don't think Cooper Flagg was my point of that. I think LeBron was, I think Wembanyama was, and the closest in between those 20-year spans was Anthony Davis. So you had a very near generational prospect and you won once. And now you have all these classes with number one picks and you haven't won. And recently, it's not like your recruiting classes have gotten worse. Yes, the transfer portal prioritizes being older, but Kentucky's been older too. So I think he's been given such a lifeline for the brand that he was able to build because there was already money in Kentucky. So now Arkansas's got money. He's going to be able to recruit the guys he already had at Kentucky. So I think next year is going to be the real barometer because you'll be like, oh, he didn't have enough time to build it. But he's still going to have Big Z follows him. He's got Carter Knox following him, likely front runner for Janelle Davis, who I think is an all-American caliber player. And so, yes, they could have success. But I think this is not a good thing in the long run for Arkansas basketball because how long is Calipari going to coach? Like we saw people lose a little bit of a step later in their careers, including the all-time greats. Like Krzyzewski, say what you will, I'm not a huge fan. Roy Williams, he was good toward the end, but it was like lesser. Jay Wright made the Final Four, and he's like, you know what, I just don't have the juice, and cut it off early, and he was critiqued for that. Well, Calipari's gotten way too much of a lifeline. I think Arkansas is actually going to find themselves in a bit of a pickle sooner rather than later because they're going to run into what Kentucky's ran into the past few years unless they have some of those just otherworldly talents that coalesce.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think 5 years from now, Mark Pope very likely in my mind to still be the head coach in Lexington, although he could be on the hot seat if things haven't gone well. But in 5 years from now, is Calipari still going to be coaching Arkansas? I don't know. And Arkansas is not making this decision based, exactly on 5 years from now. They may be ready to move on at that point anyway. And Calipari certainly could be, but it is a bit of a, I don't want to say it's a questionable hire because I think anytime you can bring in a John Calipari, you do, but I'm not sure it's going to work as well as maybe some fans are hoping. And again, if it's more of the same, is that actually what you want in Fayetteville? You may think yes now, but you may not. It's pretty frustrating. It's pretty frustrating to have a lot of talent and not be winning in the NCAA tournament. And we'll see if that ends up being the case for Arkansas. Leaf, one more team to talk about here before we move on. Vanderbilt fires Jerry Stackhouse after 5 years. He had one really great year. pretty mediocre otherwise. Last year was a big disaster for them. Really struggled to win games in the conference tournament. They go out and get Mark Byington from James Madison. Byington, of course, led that Duke's team to an NCAA tournament appearance, really successful regular season. Their second year in the Sun Belt, 32-4 overall. Byington had success at Georgia Southern prior to being at James Madison as well. What do you think about the Vanderbilt's ability to land Byington here?
I loved it. I thought it was an awesome hire because Byington plays a brand of basketball that moves up. Like some teams play gimmicky basketball in mid majors. What I mean by that is, it can present trouble because high major teams won't have seen it.
Yeah.
Well, what they did is they overwhelmed Wisconsin athletically. Like it wasn't like they were just like pressing and playing havoc basketball like the way that VCU did, or even with the way Samford did, where they didn't have the horses, but they just press every possession and hope to wear down a thin Kansas team. They pressured the ball in the half court. They pressured a full court. They rebounded pretty well. They had athletes. So I believe he can recruit, because if you're able to recruit James Madison decently enough to have the athletes to overwhelm D1 teams, and especially a good team in Wisconsin, like, yes, Wisconsin had their ups and downs, but that was a team that was in the top 10 for part of the year and is a very well-coached basketball team by Greg Gard. So I think at Vanderbilt, that's a nice place to be. Like Nashville has the appeal for players to go. I think he can get athletes that will be able to compete on the SEC level, and your expectations are fairly low, even though you have a lot of NBA players. So you have the history of NBA players. You have fairly low expectations in the short term because Stackhouse really fell off. And I think just the way he coaches basketball is conducive to success in the modern scoring is more important than defense way.
Well, Mark Byington, not the only mid-major star coach to get poached by a top program. We saw that happen a handful of times in both the Big Ten and the Big 12, including FAU's Dusty May heading over to Michigan. We're going to talk about whether that is the best hire of the offseason coming up in just a second. Right after I tell you that today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Folks, it is playoff time in both the NBA and NHL. Baseball is in full swing right now, and FanDuel is your place to bet on every single game. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $150 win or lose. So bet on everything from slap shots to home runs to slam dunks, all on an app that is safe, secure, and super easy to use. And folks, FanDuel already has lines on the Kentucky versus Arkansas games next season. Right now, the Cats are favored to win at home against Arkansas with minus 162 odds. If you want in on that early action for this matchup, what are you waiting for? Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet an automatic W. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Leaf, moving on, continuing our conversation here, ranking, grading, discussing all of the 14 high major head coach changes that we've seen so far this offseason. Think we're probably done with coaching changes, but knock on wood, you never know if we're going to see more or not. I want to start in the Big Ten there's 4 coaching changes in the Big Ten. 2 of them are traditional Big Ten schools. 2 of them are former Pac-12 schools who are moving into the Big Ten. I will start with the more traditional programs. You got Michigan replacing alum Juwan Howard with Dusty May from FAU. And then you have Ohio State, who fired Chris Holtmann toward the end of the season and then ultimately just hired Jake Diebler, who had replaced him as the interim coach. Ohio State went on a nice run to finish out the season, and they decided, you know what, we're just going to stick with our guy Diebler here. Go ahead and kind of pick which one of those 2 programs you want to talk about first.
Well, I think we got to look at Dusty May just because I think he's the most high-profile coach from a low major that we've seen in a long, long time. Like, you don't see someone go to the Final Four and then say, I'm going to stay in Boca Raton, Florida, because it's beautiful here and I've got my guys. That, like, even though Florida is maybe more beautiful and desirable of a destination, in college basketball or college athletics, football, whatever you want it to be, no coach with that type of success is able to stay where they are. And he did it for a year, and it was like, man, how commendable is that? Well, all of a sudden they have a little bit more of a bumpier patch, but he still guides them to the NCAA tournament. They were not the team that they were last year, despite having all the same pieces. But then you see, okay, well, let's hire him now. Like, I think maybe we could get him this time. And so, like, you wonder if Indiana missed the tournament like they did, would he go back to where he was taught by Bobby Knight? That's what I always thought. So Michigan gets him. I think it's a home run because Juwan Howard had a great first year where they got the 1 seed with Franz Wagner. They had Isaiah Livers and Hunter Dickinson. and then they've fallen off. There's been some scandals. There's been the mushing of Greg Gard's face, and all this stuff that you don't need. Dusty May's already recruited a really good team. He's proven he can go to the Final Four with a team built for mid-majors. So now if he can recruit like Michigan can recruit with money, and he brings in his own players, granted they couldn't get Janelle Davis due to academic admissions, which hurts their chances. I think Michigan's going to be a power in the Big Ten once again pretty quickly.
Yeah, I like the additions they have made. I would certainly be frustrated if I was Dusty May, unable to get some of those guys. I did mention this on a podcast recently that I wonder if May, coming from a mid-major background where a lot of those schools tend to be more academic focused than athletic focused, I wonder if that will help him be more prepared for some of the issues he might run into at Michigan. I'm sure it was frustrating to not get John L. Davis, but they go get Danny Wolf, they get Roddy Gale, they get a handful of other really talented players coming into that program. I'm with you. This is a slam dunk hire. I don't see how it could be kind of graded any other way. Dusty May's proven he's a phenomenal coach. He's a phenomenal recruiter. He can retain talent. I don't think Michigan could have done much better here. But I'm more intrigued by the Ohio State decision here. Jake Diebler looked like a good coach in the couple weeks that he coached this Ohio State team, but we also often see teams kind of have a reinvigoration when their coach gets fired, and I wonder how much of it was that. Now, Diebler has navigated the transfer portal well so far this offseason, so maybe it is a situation where it's like an addition by subtraction with Holtman out the door. I think he's done a good job of recruiting at DePaul. We'll talk about that later, but it certainly was an odd decision. Like when Ohio State's job is open, you expected, we heard rumors that Calipari had been interested in that job. Who knows how legitimate those were, how serious talks were there, but like you expect them to land a really big name, and instead they just promote internally. I think it's fair to have some skepticism about this, even if the early transfer portal returns have been solid.
I actually really like staying with Diebler because I think that Ohio State was starting to go away from their identity. They had Thad Matta for so long. Holtman came in after being with Butler, but they kind of went to this, like, we aren't getting, yes, they had Sensabaugh and a few other players that had success, like EJ Liddell, but they weren't the type of recruits that Ohio State was so accustomed to getting and having this, like, we're the Buckeyes, we're a Big Ten power. And I feel like this has restored kind of that historical, like, his brother played on the team. There's this, like, he's a Buckeye through and through. He's got the support of the Aaron Crafts of the world. You've heard people talk about and be vocal about, well, this is the guy we'd want to go play for. So I wonder if he's just that kind of, like, this is a culture instilling type of hire. And because he's been there through different regimes, that people like him, that have been there when they're at their highest, and people liked him when they were at their lowest, and he could kind of reinstill that belief that we are the Ohio State Buckeyes that won a lot of Big Ten championships in the postseason, that made the Final Fours. So I think it's a good hire, but obviously you have concerns that say, well, he didn't get the players there. Those players were Holtman's players, and he just kind of like used a revitalized team. Like, I get that. Every interim coach is either going to be like, hey, well, they're sinking with the ship because if they still don't play well, they're done and they won't ever get another chance, or they just get a reinvigorated team. But I actually tend to believe the signs. I thought Ohio State was going to beat Illinois in the Big Ten tournament, and then they could even find their way into the tournament, and he was going to get hired. So I'm happy that he still got hired. I think at least he earned the right to get another chance. Yeah. And because you're Ohio State, you have a chance. If he doesn't do well next year, you can say, well, you know what, sorry. And it doesn't like hurt your brand at all. You're Ohio State. You can go hire the next best basketball coach that you think you can get.
Let's talk about the other two Big Ten schools, the two that are former Pac-12 schools. USC, of course, replaces Andy Enfield with Eric Musselman. Enfield took that SMU job, and then they went and got Musselman coming back to his home area of LA. Of course, former Nevada coach, had been at Arkansas for 5 years. And then Washington, this is my favorite hire of the cycle. I don't know if it's going to turn out to be the best quote unquote hire, but I love what Danny Sprinkle has done. He was great at Montana State. He had 1 year at Utah State and kept that program at a really high level. They were excellent throughout the season. I think he's a very good X's and O's coach. I thought that this was a slam dunk move by UW to bring Danny Sprinkle over. So as these two programs kind of navigate into the Big Ten, what did you think about these two kind of different stylistic hires, but pretty notable hires nonetheless?
I liked Sprinkle a lot because at and ironically enough, I saw him play a couple years ago at March Madness. And I was thinking to myself, oh, wow, like this team doesn't have a chance against the athletes that Texas Tech has. But like the fact that they're in the tournament, even though they're getting like absolutely mollywopped, impressed me just because Like, how do you get into the tournament with this level of athletes? So then he goes and up a division to Utah State, and he lose a lot of their talent. Like their best two players went to VCU with the prior regime, and he gets them to their first regular season outright title. They win a game in the tournament, and now you go to Washington, which is a hotbed of basketball talent. Like Seattle, Washington has a lot of hoopers. They're going to the Big Ten, which is a better basketball league than was the Pac-12. I'm all in on Sprinkle. I think this and Dusty May are the two best hires, in my opinion.
Looking at the Big 12, 3 new coaching hires in the Big 12. Mark Pope, of course, has to be replaced at BYU. They go get Kevin Young, an assistant coach for the Phoenix Suns. Oklahoma State let go of Mike Boynton and brought in Steve Lutz, who had just led Western Kentucky to the NCAA tournament. And then West Virginia. In the notes I put, replaced Josh Ehlert with Darian DeVries. It's kind of technically replacing Bob Huggins because Ehlert was that interim head coach, like you said. Sometimes you just got to sink with the ship, and that was kind of the story for Ehlert, unfortunately, because not only did West Virginia get their roster gashed by the Bob Huggins firing, but also they had guys who were ineligible at the start of the year, some suspensions, some injuries, just a really rough year in Morgantown. And now they bring in Darian DeVries. Out of these 3 hires, is there anyone in particular that kind of stands out to you, Leaf?
I'll start with the Kevin Young one just because there's a local tie. Kevin Young, the reason I really like this hire, and I think it should be graded in a different scale than some of the others, is because a coach at BYU has to be an active member of the LDS faith. And so that really minimizes who you can get. And so everyone in Utah thought that it would be associate head coach for the Utes, Chris Burgess, because he had ties there. He'd coached at BYU before. He recruited Colin Chandler for Mark Pope, who obviously Chandler followed Pope to Kentucky. But I was like, okay, well, it's a shoo-in. Like that's the only other guy. Like the assistant coach at BYU at the time, Cody Feger, is really well regarded, but he's not LDS, so that he's eliminated. And now you've got 2 other names, and it was Barrett Peary and then one of the coaches at UVU. And no one at BYU who's got a proud tradition and they have a lot of money think like, oh, like we're going to go for anyone of these other than Burgess. So when they found a guy who's the highest paid assistant in the NBA, who has plans to be a college basketball coach because he doesn't love the lifestyle of the NBA. So that means he's committed to that lifestyle. I think he wants to move in, settle down, and he's got a long contract that pays lucratively. I think they got a stability and a foundation that you typically don't when recruiting for college basketball coaches, but they also got a guy who has basketball knowledge and a commitment to a program just because of the faith aspect of it. So I think when I grade that, that's one of the more impressive hires, in my opinion, because they had to do it fighting uphill.
Yep. I 100% agree. When I was kind of looking at who's BYU going to hire and started trying to put some lists together and read some other lists, I was like, yeah, they're just limited in who they can bring in, who is going to be able to kind of keep this program at the same level that they were at under Pope. And I think they found a guy who's capable of doing that. And so I think, considering the limitations of the pool, I think this is a really big hire for them. I'm very interested to see how he does. And looking at the other 2, I mean, Lutz had success at Texas A&M, Corpus Christi. He had 1 year at Western Kentucky, but helped turn them around. I think if you're Oklahoma State, Mike Boynton was really loved there as a recruiter, as just a personality, but the X's and O's just weren't very good, and the winning on the court just wasn't happening. So going to get a coach who's done that, who's had that success, I think you feel pretty good about that. And for West Virginia, Darian DeVries, a lot of success for him. He brings over Tucker DeVries, his son. Very curious to see how Tucker adjusts to being in the Big 12 after being a 20-point per game scorer at Drake previously. But two coaching hires here that I'm cautiously optimistic on, but with these mid-major coaches, I think a lot of times you expect, hey, he's just going to step in and have success just like he did at the low major level. And sometimes they do. Sometimes you get a Nate Oates or you get an Eric Musselman or you get somebody who comes in and wins right away. And sometimes you don't. And I'm curious about these 2. I'm more likely to believe that DeVries can turn West Virginia around quicker than Lutz can turn Oklahoma State around. But both these guys have had plenty of success at the low major level.
I'm right there with you.
Well, folks, we're going to talk about the ACC and the one coaching change in the Big East because, folks, Rob Lanier's firing at SMU. It started a wild coaching carousel that led Andy Enfield to SMU, eventually, of course, led Mark Pope to Kentucky. But was Andy Enfield going to SMU even the best new hire in the ACC? We're going to discuss that in just a second. But first, I want to tell you that today's episode is brought to you by Monopoly Go. Folks, we have all been there. either as a player or as a fan. It's halftime, the scoreboard, it's not looking too good. You're feeling low, not sure you or your team can pull out a W, and that's when you dig deep, lift your head up, and say to yourself, time to get back in the game, pull off some bank heists, and take as much of my friends' money as I possibly can. That's right, the smash hit mobile game Monopoly Go lets you compete with your friends to get the most riches and biggest empire. It's the Monopoly you love, but on your phone anytime with tons of new twists, including leaderboards to compare your progress to your buddies. There is so much you can do. Play on countless dynamic Monopoly boards, make your friends bankrupt by smashing their landmarks with a wrecking ball, charging other players rent for your iconic properties. You can even work with your friends to crack open community chests and in tournaments to get extra rewards and climb the leaderboard. So get back out there, put on your game face, and download Monopoly Go now free on the App Store or the Google Play Store. Today's episode is also brought to you by Gametime. Folks, the weather is heating up out here, at least in the Pacific Northwest, and that means it's time to go take in some Major League Baseball games. And folks, great news. Gametime is now an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets even faster and easier. And folks, prices on the Gametime app, they actually go down the closer it gets to first pitch. So with killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, Gametime takes the guesswork out of buying Major League Baseball tickets. And one of my favorite features on the Gametime app is their last-minute deals. Maybe you want to get tickets for an NBA playoff game. You can save up to 60% off buying last-minute tickets for not only sporting events, but concerts, comedy, theater, and more. And I often worry about my tickets being bogus, but with Gametime's ticket coverage, your purchase is covered by the most flexible customer service policy in the ticketing industry. I love having that peace of mind. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off. Download the Gametime app today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. All right, Leaf coming back here. Segment 3, joined by Leaf Tulane. Andy Patton here, host of Locked On College Basketball. We are continuing our conversation talking about all 14 new head coach hires in the high major level. We're closing out the show talking ACC and Big East here. Starting the ACC, we'll start at Louisville, because it felt like Louisville was going to win their coaching search here pretty much regardless, because anybody was going to be better than what they were getting from Kenny Payne, just a disastrous hire that really couldn't have gone a whole lot worse for the Cardinals. But not only did they replace Kenny Payne, which was always going to be a good thing, they got who I think is a really fantastic coach in Pat Kelsey coming over from Charleston. We saw Charleston make the tournament back-to-back years. He's a young coach. He's got a lot of experience working with great coaches as an assistant. Really dynamic offense. We've already seen Louisville add a handful of very talented players in the recruiting or in the transfer portal as well. So a hire that I'm very excited about for Louisville.
I'm torn on this one because Louisville is one of those teams in which I think has the money and the cachet to get whomever they want.
Yeah.
And going from a Kenny Payne to anyone, frankly, was going to be a win. So I'm not trying to say that it's not, but I think it could have been a larger win in the sense of there were targets with more of a resume that you could lead to believe would be conducive to success at Louisville in the rebuilding phase. That said, I love his enthusiasm, like on a personal level, his enthusiasm, his humor about being hired and just like recent success that inspires some faith.
Yeah.
But Louisville could get a lot of players or coaches, but like players in the sense of like they've got the money to contend with whomever. They can get the recruits. Like they're paying basically $2 million to get some recruits right now. Like that's just that's the state of Louisville basketball. And that's what the state of Kentucky, between Kentucky basketball and Louisville basketball, is about. So if you're going to go from the mid-major ranks from Charleston, if I were Louisville, if I'm going mid-major, you have to get Dusty May. So it's an unfair criticism for Kelsey because it's not his fault, but it just to me feels a little bit like that program can afford better in terms of sustained success. But I am optimistic because I think he's got the patience and the enthusiasm and the job security of like how much they paid him to make Louisville relevant again. And basketball's better when Louisville's good. Like it's the ACC is not fun when you have teams that you expect to be awesome be terrible. Like Florida State too has not been very good recently. Louisville's been bad. Virginia, even though they made the tournament stupidly, like when they're good and those other two I mentioned are good, the ACC is an awesome product, and I'm hoping it gets back to that.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think that it's a bit more of a risk to take a chance on Kelsey, but I think it could pay off pretty handsomely for Louisville. in the future if it works out. But yeah, a bit more of a risk than maybe some would have wanted them to take. But looking ahead to the other two ACC schools, again, it's weird with conference realignment. It's SMU and Stanford are the two other ACC programs that had coaching changes. Of course, SMU, they're bringing in Andy Enfield coming over from USC. Enfield had some success. USC, not a traditionally great basketball program, and he helped lead them to more success than they typically have. Recruited well, brought in some high-profile players, but last year did not go well with Isaiah Collier, the presumed number one pick, who didn't have a very good year. Had some injury issues as well. Bronny James, same situation, didn't perform at the level we expected, but also missed the early part of the year coming off of that cardiac arrest. But Boogie Ellis, Kobe Johnson, like Joshua Morgan, there should have been more success at USC last year than there was. I don't think there's any debating that. But I'm curious to see what he can do at SMU as that program transitions into the ACC, as they're in a very unique spot geographically in a conference where every other team in the conference is either on the East Coast or on the West Coast in Stanford and Cal. And speaking of Stanford, they let go of Jared Haas after 7 years. No NCAA tournament appearances for the former UAB coach. A rough era of Stanford basketball. They were getting talent, bringing in good players, but not able to sustain any success in the Pac-12. Now, as they move into the ACC, they bring in Kyle Smith, his brand of basketball, nerd ball, as they call it. He had success at Columbia, success at San Francisco, success at Washington State. Now he comes to Stanford. I'm very excited to see what Kyle Smith can do with the Cardinals program.
Me too. I've been off Jared Haas's train for a long time. I've been rooting for Stanford to get a new coach for about 4 years on a personal level. But back to Kyle Smith, when it was becoming real that they actually were going to move off of Jared Haas, Kyle Smith was the first name I thought of. And I said this on a local Utah radio show, and Washington State had just played Utah. And my take was, he's won in difficult places to win, and the transfer portal and NIL is not making Stanford an alluring place. But living in Stanford is something that people will like, and it's not far from where he's had success and he's lived before, because he lived at UCF before. And so if you can win at Columbia, you can win anywhere. If you can win at Wazoo, you can win anywhere, especially while the conferences were happening. They were a 7 seed. They won a game in the tournament. So I'm happy. The only frustration I have is that I really thought he could get Miles Rice to come to Stanford. And that broke my heart. The Hoosiers just emptied their pockets from 1980 and won. So that's an aside from another time, but that's an A+ hire. And then you look at some of the SMU moving to the ACC, Stanford moving to the ACC is just strange. But why'd they get rid of Rob Lanier? Like they outperformed expectations. And yes, Enfield's probably a plus in terms of the cachet. Like he had Dunk City, and that got him the USC job, and USC has its own cachet. So he'll be able to bring in recruits to a place in Texas, which has money. But I just don't know what to expect. So I definitely prefer the Kyle Smith over the Enfield hire.
Last coaching hire to talk about here in the Big East, DePaul. Again, somewhat similar situation to Louisville, where it's like it's going to get better because Tony Stubblefield was just not it. He's actually back at Oregon as an assistant coach, which is where he was when he first got hired at DePaul. And it just didn't work there. And they go out and they get Chris Holtmann, somebody who's obviously a former Big Ten head coach at Ohio State, had a lot of success. We've seen DePaul make a ton of additions in the transfer portal, but not a lot of super impactful additions. But again, this team's going to be better than they were last year. There's absolutely, unquestionably no debate about it. But the question here is whether Holtmann was the right guy for DePaul to pick, but whether he was the best option, because again, anything was going to be better than Stubblefield. Were you a fan of the Holtmann hire here for DePaul?
I was in between. I feel like Holtmann taking this job so soon after kind of getting ousted at Ohio State was strange.
It was odd,
Like it happened almost immediately, like, oh, this is in the works. But why would you want to go to DePaul and have a reclamation project when you were at Ohio State, and not only just a few years ago were the number 2 seed? Yes, you lost to Oral Roberts, but that's a 2 seed in the NCAA tournament. And he was good at Butler, taking over from Brad Stevens. So it just feels weird that he's kind of bounced around and the trajectory seems down. So my gut is a little bit like, why more that, but yes, like you said, like Stubblefield was doing nothing. DePaul, for better or worse, right now is in a terrible state, but they have proud basketball tradition with a lot of notable alumni. They've had tournament runs before. So you might as well get an established head coach. So I have to be happy in that regard, but it just feels weird from the Holtmann perspective.
That's going to wrap it up for us today, folks. Thank you so much for hanging out with us here. Love getting a chance to do this. Love having the guy Leaf Tulane on the show. We're going to be back later this week with more updates on the transfer portal, more of the movement going on as we get closer and closer to that NBA draft declaration deadline. And then, of course, the deadline to declare for the transfer portal coming up next week. Want to thank you all again for making the show your first listen or your first watch of the day. Remind you to join us on our Discord channel. If you have not done so yet, there's a link in the show notes for free to come hang out with us 24/7. But for now, apologies to the Lawyer family. Let's go Wildcats. And until Thursday, peace.